Great. So now let us begin with the definition of a threat. In this lecture, we will talk about the definition of a threat, different types of threats, and the relationship between vulnerability and threat. So now what is a threat? Threat is a potential cause of an unwanted incident that takes place in an organization, which can result in harm to the system or different assets to an organization. Now, a threat has the potential to actually harm the assets like information, processes, systems, people, and even the entire IT infrastructure. So basically, threat is something that can cause damage to your entire organization. Even one small vulnerability can cause the damage. Now, threats can be natural or human origin, that is, intentional threats. Someone is trying to, explicitly do something bad to your organization, to your servers, or they may be accidental. For example, someone might have left their password open on their desk in order to remember for them, but a malicious bad guy tries to dig into that and then exploits the entire system. So both accidental and deliberate threat sources should be identified, and that is why security audits are important. A threat can arise from within or from outside the organization as well. Threats should be identified generically and by the type, that is, unauthorized actions, physical damage, technical failures, etc. Now, by definition, a threat has the potential to harm the assets such as information, processes, and systems. And threats are associated with negative aspect of risk, and such refer to undesirable occurrences. Now, in interviews, while you interviews, a simple language should be used to facilitate the discussion on threats. So when you go to an interview, keep in your mind that a threat is nothing but a potential cause of an unwanted incident. Now let us have a look at the different types of threats. Physical damage, which can include fire or water damage. Natural events can also be a threat, for example, volcanic eruptions, floods, then lightning. Loss of essential services, which means failure of air conditioning of water supply of system, loss of power supply, that is a loss of essential service and it can be a threat. Disturbance due to radiation, which can include electromagnetic radiation or thermal radiation. Technical failures includes equipment failure, software malfunction, or irregular behavior of a software. Unauthorized actions, which means unauthorized use of data, corruption of data, data tamper, and data theft. And finally, compromise of functions, that is error in use, abuse of rights, upper management abusing the rights in order to exploit some things, are also a type of threats. Now, Annex C of ISO provides a typology for the classification of threats, and we must use Annex C as a guide to or a checklist to help organizations in structuring and collaboration of different types of threats. Now, there is a great relationship between a vulnerability and a threat, and it is very important for you to actually understand this relationship, because the presence of a vulnerability itself does not produce a damage. A threat must exist to exploit it. I'll repeat my sentence again. I'm saying that the presence of a vulnerability itself does not produce damage. A threat must exist to exploit that vulnerability in order to cause harm to the organization. Now let's consider that this is the vulnerability. Okay, I'll just take my pen. This is the vulnerability. And then what is the threat? The threat can be a theft in the organization. If the warehouse is left without surveillance, if there is no security guard in the warehouse, someone can take data or equipments from the warehouse. So that can result into a theft. And this theft here is a type of threat, and this is a vulnerability. Next, complicated data, which can include data input error. So in this way, complicated data can result into data input error. The next is no segregation of duties, which means fraud, unauthorized access to information, and malicious use of the information to gain leverage is a theft if the vulnerability of no segregation duties is exploited. Unencrypted data. So if the vulnerability is unencrypted data, information theft can be a threat to an organization. So I hope you are understanding what I am saying, that on the other hand, a threat that is not vulnerable cannot represent a risk. So if the data is encrypted, then there is a threat of having information theft, and that is a risk to an organization. Now note that the incorrect implementation or use of a malfunction of a control could itself represent a threat. If the security controls are not implemented properly, that itself it can represent a threat to an organization. So auditors play an important role when it comes to security controls, and that is why it is good to have an experienced and qualified auditor in order to place the security controls. So I hope you have understood this relationship between a vulnerability and a threat. So if a vulnerability is exploited, then there is a possibility of a threat. So this was it for this lecture. We saw what is a threat, we saw what are the types of different threats, and we saw the relationship between the vulnerability and threat. Now I will see you in the next lecture.